So, good evening, everyone, to everyone in the room and everyone online. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to this first Dialogues in Development of the new 2024-25 academic year. My name is Karen Levy, and I'm Professor of Transformative Urban Planning here at the Bartlett Development Planning Unit, and I'm going to be chairing this event this evening. As you may have heard, in 2024, the DPU is celebrating 70 years of work in international development planning education, research, and international practice engagement in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. And we've done this celebration through a series of events with the wider DPU community, with our partners and peers, sharing critical experiences and debates generated through our joint engagement in this wide range of activities. And in fact, this is actually the 10th public event this year, even though it's your first event in terms of the new academic year. So far, we've held a DPU Film Festival and 7 previous Dialogues in Development, and you can find all these sessions online under the DPU70 banner on our website. And there's been some really terrifically interesting sessions, so please do check that out. This evening, before I go on, I also want to say, pertinent to this session, this year we're also celebrating 40 years of working with gender justice in the DPU. And I say that because bringing our 70 years of general work in development and our 40 years of working with gender justice, if you bring them together, they're both significant anniversaries in the title of our event this evening, the feminist turn of environmental justice. In its origins, the environmental justice movement came out of a concern for racial and class inequalities related to negative environmental impacts in the US over 40 years ago. Since then, it's just expanded its scope in different directions. It's including embracing a wide range of other intersectoral social identities and an international scope of geographies in the way that it's developed. This evening, our panel will address the following 2 big questions. Okay? What has a feminist perspective brought to the pursuit of environmental justice as a critical inquiry, as a collective struggle, as a means to decolonize research and planning, practice and theory? And the second question, what has a feminist perspective brought as a means to promote alternatives based on collective power, care and solidarity? To address these challenging questions, we have 3 speakers. They are my colleagues, Giordana Romario, Bruna Ferreira Montori, and Adriana Allen. And I'll introduce them more fully when they speak. Okay? So we're going to start our evening with Giordana. Giordana is an associate professor in development planning and diversity in the DPU. She's also the program leader for our MSc in urban development planning. And she has over 15 years of experience working in the field of diversity and socially inclusive community development with non-governmental organizations based in the UK, the Philippines, East Africa, Panama, and Canada. Seeking to promote more socially just urban development in her work, her research interests span the field of feminist political ecology and gender and development in urban geography. She's currently the co-PI on a new 3-year research project called Listen, Learn and Leap, co-producing equitable and sustainable nature-based solutions for climate resilience in East African cities. And Giordana will be laying the foundation for our discussion this evening. So, Giordana, would you like to come in? Thanks,
Excellent. Okay. Two screens. Right. Thanks everyone for being here. I think preparing for this talk was interesting because this is definitely sort of the bread and butter of what I've been thinking about for the past very, very long time, what I teach about on a regular basis. So packaging this into a 10-minute, 15-minute presentation is a little bit tricky. So just bear with me. I thought I wanted to start this by thinking about the title of our talk. So the feminist turn environmental justice. And when I was preparing for this, I think where I started was really trying to think about, well, what is or was the feminist turn? Like, when did that kind of a moment happen? And probably like many people in the room today, I was led back to ecofeminism, actually. I think that's like it's kind of like this moment in time where ideas about gender and the environment really came into the kind of public foray and the international attention of policymakers, right? And that was largely, do I use that one? Yeah. That was largely thanks to this woman here. Not only thanks to her, but I think Vandana Shiva played a really, really big role through her activism, through her advocacy, through her writings, to draw attention to the kind of overlap, these distinct but also very interconnected processes, she argued, of gender inequality, of environmental degradation, of resource exploitation, and the kind of scientific commodification of nature, right? So she was arguing basically that these distinct but very kind of overlapping forms of oppression are connected and are very much driven by, again, overlapping what she labeled masculinist kind of spaces or power dynamics and ideologies that were linked to patriarchy, to racist colonial expansion, and to environmental exploitation, right? And that was kind of the overarching crux of a lot of her arguments. But I think when we think about this in terms of how it's informed the women, environment, and development debates and thinking about gender and development, which has since ensued, there was this framing of women as like being both virtuous and vulnerable, to quote from Aurora Johnson, right? This idea that women, I think this is where ecofeminism started to lose some of its audience, was this idea that like women were kind of naturally and spiritually more connected to nature as a consequence of not only their reproductive labors and their responsibility, the closeness that they shared to labor or to nature because of the kind of work that they were doing, but also that this was somehow innately natural or spiritual, linked to kind of ideas of internal altruism and so on, right? Sort of linked to the first point was the argument that women, because they are working more closely with nature, are understandably going to be more vulnerable to or exposed to environmental risk or impacted by the environmental degradation, right? The depletion of natural resources. And so, building on that, when we think about this in the context of like policy arenas, the ways that this was kind of beaten up at the time, it was a really important and quite like provocative set of arguments at the time. We see this kind of identification or targeting of women as strategic and efficient agents for delivering environmental conservation and broader sustainable development outcomes, right? And this is all happening around the 1980s. It's happening simultaneous to wider discussions that very much mirrored this in the kind of gender and development space, or women in development, as it was at that moment. And it was critiqued. It was critiqued almost like the moment that it came out, because the kind of debates happening around women in the environment were kind of slightly behind, but also mirroring debates that were happening in broader development, right? And it was critiqued for romanticizing nature and women's relationship to it, really neglecting like the challenges of women's interactions with the natural environment or with environmental risks, right? And sometimes rendering that quite invisible in the narratives that were coming forward. Again, another really important point was, and critique was this kind of reproduction of very biological biologically deterministic stereotypes about women, their role, and their relationship to nature, right? So rather than critiquing a lot of the biological deterministic stereotypes that feminists were arguing against, this narrative was seen to kind of reproduce that. And in doing that, they were homogenizing women and kind of rendering invisible or just neglecting different types of women and the realities of environmental relationships and relationships to nature being very much subjectively situated, being embodied, and being different depending on who you are, where you come from, socioeconomics, etc. Right? And again, connected to that, if we don't think about those things, we're kind of rendering invisible the broader structural relations that are underpinning not only gendered labor and divisions of labor that we've seen are like actually connected to how we interact with nature, but also on a more geopolitical level. Like, even though I think the work of Dana Shiba very much sought to highlight the geopolitics of these dynamics of exploitation, at the same time they were kind of being rendered maybe less visible or less, I don't know, less important, right? We stopped thinking about the power relations underpinning these things, and focusing on how women can kind of serve environmental conservation agendas. Never mind men. Another really big kind of critique is that men were really absent from these discussions, right? And so that's the end of my lecture on ecofeminism. But the crux of what I want to say here is that, like, I went back and revisited a lot of this, and I think this is why it was tricky for me to kind of package how I look forward, is because I wonder how far we've kind of come from these debates, right? Like, I think these debates and the critiques that ensued have very much like paved the way for feminist political ecology and feminist urban geography, where I situate my own work. And there's this kind of tension that exists between the original points and arguments that were made in those books and by subsequent activists and academics, through to the critiques that lead us to the current moment. And I want to speak about a couple of those. I think that there remain like a number of tensions that kind of, I don't know how far we've come. And like one, for example, in my own work relates to labor and how we think about gendered labor and how we move beyond this kind of sometimes simplistic way of thinking about gendered labor as like, this is men's space, this is women's space, and thinking about how that impacts access to resources and so on, right? In my own work, actually, I was looking at the ways in which gendered participation plays out and gendered impacts play out in the context of disaster risk governance and kind of urban resilience agendas, right? And over the course of my work, I think one thing that I can really draw from this trajectory, the ways in which it shaped my engagement with that field, was to really push me to think from differentiated kind of different embodied experiences, right? So trying another tension, trying to meaningfully engage with questions of intersectionality, trying to meaningfully engage with questions of difference, without falling into these kind of tropes of stereotypes around gender, which were being reproduced by a lot of people that I was speaking to. And what I found and what I argued kind of comes back to the previous slide, points around gendered labor and the ways in which that impacts struggles over land, rights, access to resources, and exposure to environmental risks, right? What I found in my work in the Philippines is that women are leading these movements happening in informal settlements and so-called danger zones. And what I've argued is that, and what I found, and I argued, is that the reason why they're leading this is because they're more affected by it. And I didn't mean it to kind of fall back into this idea of women are more affected by risk. The women are more affected by risk. And so there's a tension, right? Like, how do we, I was working with men as well. I think like I heeded the critiques, as I think many of us do. But I guess a question that comes from that work is like, okay, so we recognize women are at the helm of a lot of environmental justice and climate resilience agendas. We recognize that that's because they're more impacted or differentially impacted by a lot of these issues that are taking place within home environments, especially when we're working in kind of lower income neighborhoods that are affected by environmental and climate resilience issues, right? But how do we then move beyond the instrumentalization of women's labor within these processes? We can recognize why it's there, but how do we move beyond when we're thinking about kind of I don't know, questions of justice, thinking about Nancy Fraser's work, thinking about the Sustainable Development Goals and trying to engender these processes and build environmental justice towards more kind of equitable ends. How do we shift those binaries in terms of labor and resources? I think another thing that remains a tension for me, but also an entry point, I'll start with the entry point and then I'll move to the tension, is the provocations that I think came from that for me was this real push, as I said before, to think from different places, right? So a question that I pose to all of us is like, what happens when we think from the margins, the periphery, the south, from nature, as I've been encouraged by a colleague who's working with me on a new NBS project. Like, what happens when we situate our epistemic kind of standpoint, or try to, from these different places? Like, what new ways of knowing emerge? What new creativities and kind of solutions come from these different spaces of knowing, right? But there's a lot of tensions there, right? Because the realities that were highlighted before are these like really entrenched privileging of techno-scientific language, of lexicons of urban resilience, of ways of identifying both problem and solution, right? And so I think what feminist thinking has like given to me is the tools, or like a set of ideas to critique, if not a way forward, right? And I think that that's the challenge that we're always sitting with. It's like we can understand the shortcomings of a lot of our language. We can understand the geopolitical power structures that inform power over knowledge, power to produce knowledge, and the consequences that come from that. But how do we shift beyond that, right? And so in the context of my new project looking at nature-based solutions, like a key sticking point that we have yet to really work through is how do we define that? How does the term nature-based solution even translate, right? How it doesn't. We're working in East African cities. We can't even find a term to translate the word nature into Swahili because it doesn't exist in the way that in one word, right? So and what are the implications? Again, thinking about feminist principles of environmental justice. If we have these terms that are kind of imported from the West but become the mantras of urban resilience building and sustainable development, as NBS is starting to become, what are the implications of defining things in particular ways for the different groups that we're working with, right? If we define it using this language, who has access to resources seeking to fund working with nature to address different challenges? If we define nature-based solutions, the solution that we're looking for solely in biodiversity terms, what gets lost, right? So I'm going to stop there, but I think leaving us with, I think a lot of tensions that I'm sitting with in terms of how far have we kind of managed to move beyond the critiques that were, given to eco-feminist thoughts in the 1980s. How far have we moved beyond that? But also what new possibilities emerge when we sit with feminist intention, with just intentions, to create from different epistemic positions. So I think my colleagues are going to pick up from that. So I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Giovanna, for a very solid foundation for our presentations to come. I want to introduce you to our next speaker, Bruna. Bruna came to us at the DPU as a research fellow on this new project that Giovanna is talking about, on Listen, Learn and Delete project. But she is an urban researcher investigating the relations between space, community development and autonomy through participatory methods, and she did her PhD research on the ways the NGO Redes de Mare in Rio de Janeiro uses urban space to promote citizen awareness and empowerment, breaking with the stereotypes and creating new imaginaries for that particular place. She will, in our session tonight, will expand on the role, I would say, of different geographies in understanding the feminist turn of environmental justice. So over to you.
Thank you, Karen, for the introduction. I will bring you now more or less where I stand currently. So I come from Brazil, and my research is about Maré, which is a group of 16 formal settlements in the north side of Rio de Janeiro. And recently I just joined this new research fellow postdoc where I am working with two main cities in East Africa, which are Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. And interestingly, while I have expanded a lot on feminism in the context of Latin America, in the context of East Africa, new interesting perspectives emerged for me, particularly when I started seeing that Brazil and Africa as a continent, but East Africa and particularly Tanzania, had so many connections. Oftentimes, I just spent 3 weeks in Tanzania. I felt like I was in my own country, but I couldn't understand the language. So that was kind of the feeling. But in a nutshell, the connections between both places brought me here today, and also to continue a bit of the discussion that Jordana brought to us. So basically, I'm going to take you into this swapped version of the world map, where we can see this encounter between the two continents of South America and Africa. And thinking mainly of a few women that have been pretty much trying to contest some of the tensions and some of the aspects that Jordana was mentioning, of women being vulnerable or women being in such conditions, but actually bringing the reality of what is it like to be a Black, indigenous, peripheral woman living in context and outside of Europe or the so-called global north. So a few of these women that you're seeing here in this map, I have been dialoguing with them since I started working as a designer after I left my undergrad. And recently, I have been engaging with Marjorie Mbilini, who is a scholar from Tanzania. But maybe what is interesting about them is that how each of the points that they're bringing and their concepts and their ideas, they help us observe first how these two areas of the globe are so deeply connected, and second, how they are trying to propose another understanding of environmental justice for us today. So I'm just going to give an overview very quickly, and then I'm going to go into a few points, so just you follow my lead. So basically, we go back to the 70s. Marjorie Mbilini, she's a woman that actually traveled to Canada, and that's where she did her studies. So she's one of the first theories that is discussing the role of the women in the context of Tanzania in the 1970s, and that's literally less than a decade that this country became independent. Tanzania is a socialist country coming from a revolution where the people, mainly led by Professor Giulio Nyerere, who was the first president, where they understand Tanzania as a country that is grounded on socialist grounds, where they are connected with the villages, the roots. What Jordana was talking about, nature-based solutions and the notion of nature, actually the translation, there is no direct translation. What we have been observing, actually what we see is that nature goes back to asili, which asili means roots, means the connection with the villages, with the rural landscape. But mostly what Mbilini is trying to say is actually that the women, despite being conditioned to a specific role as mothers, as grandmothers, as the ones who are cooking and caretaking, they are actually pivotal figures within the economy of the country. And she's going to contest the way that these roles are portrayed. Whereas if we go later, in 1984, we're going to see Lélia Gonzalez, who is dialoguing directly with Angela Davis' notions of race, class, and gender. And she's looking into the perspectives of the Black women in Brazil. So she's looking into how women in the country are actually way deeper, especially the Black women, way deeper connected with Meridian and African roots rather than European roots. So she's looking into the way that Black women are hypersexualized, but at the same time, how they are the center of the labor, reproduction labor in the country. We have Beatriz Nascimento, who is looking into the Black Atlantic liberation, who's looking into the Black conscience in the country, and observing how these diasporas, they frame how the Black people resist and live in the country, in Brazil. It's really interesting because while I was in Tanzania, the language is Kiswahili. But Kiswahili comes from a Bantu root of language. And a lot of the words that we speak in Brazil, they come from Kikongo or Kimbundo, which are also languages coming from the Bantu languages. So it's really interesting how everything is interconnected through the diasporas. And what Beatriz is saying is pretty much that most of the memories, ancestrality is connected through this diaspora. Gloria Anzaldúa is looking into the borderlands, La Frontera, the Chicana, the woman that is living in the US, but she has Hispanic roots, and her role into trying to find her identity within this condition and this location. She's going to look into the different conocimientos, so the different types of knowledge beyond the geopolitics of knowledge that positions scientific knowledge as a supremacy. Maria Lugones in the 2008 is going to look into the coloniality of being, so the perspective of the women being conditioned through a colonial mindset, and how the bodies of colonized, and after the end of colonization, how their bodies are also instrumentalized for a very specific purpose of reproductive labor. And later, one of the last concepts that I worked was the body territory, which is, I'm not sure Veronica Gallo coined this term, but she wrote extensively about it, where she's going to look at the body as the main point for you to understand territories, and how women, particularly in the peripheries or dealing with oppression, they put their bodies at the forefront to make their fights. So I'm bringing first a bit of Marjorie's into debunking imposed roles and identities. She's looking into, for an example, how urbanization and modernization, in theory, would bring positive changes in women's status. And she's looking in the way that women would become less subordinated economically, politically, and socially to their husbands than under earlier conditions. But actually what she observed is that it's actually that before the modernization and urbanization, women had a much more pivotal role into the economy of the country. So contesting the way this top-down, male-led gaze approaches the role of women in East African context. Whereas when we think of the body territory, now this is a non-linear set of reflections that I brought to you. Here we have in this image Lélia Gonzalez, who was one of the co-founders of the Movimento Negro Unificado, which is the Black Unified Movement in Brazil, fighting for the right of the Black women in the country and their right to vote and their right to be involved in the democracy. And here we have the protest. So many of these discussions would later lead to what we see here, which is the protest for Marielle Franco's, the council woman who was murdered in 2018, who achieved a space in the Congress as a politician, fighting for the rights, which directly connect to justice and the environment, particularly in context of peripheries. And not to dismiss also the movement Nem Presa Nem Morta, which is not dead, not imprisoned, which fights for the rights of abortion. So it's this idea that the body is a battleground. These are places of rebellion against oppressive systems. Another aspect that I want to bring you is the recreating citizenship through praxis. Here, what you see in the picture is an image from Eliana Souza Silva. She is the director of Redes da Maré, the organization I researched in my PhD. But she was the first female president of a favelas association, a resident association in a favela, in an informal settlement in Rio de Janeiro, with only 22 years old. And she is constantly looking into citizenship as something that is not granted, not given, but it's a practice, it's something incremental that you build slowly. And she has this notion, and I connect her perspective, this perspective that she brought brings with finite times understanding that if we are to achieve a human urbanism, professional planning must recognize these other critical actors and the important spaces of citizenship they innovate and invent, because their role and weight in bringing about change are even more important than the previous century. I have just 2 more slides, I promise. I also like to bring this notion of transnational and translocal solidarities by showing you the 2 contexts of Rio de Janeiro and in Dar es Salaam, which was really remarkable in my opinion, because I could see everything I saw during my PhD in the moment that I arrived in Dar es Salaam. The women, the Federation women fighting for basic rights, for sanitation rights, that's exactly the same that is happening. So these transnational and translocal solidarities, they are formed through mobilization, through women that are constantly looking into care as a form of labor, and how that labor needs to be paid, how that labor needs to be recognized. And the ancestral futures in the Black transatlantic space, so bringing back the notion of Beatriz Nascimento, so looking into how all these diasporic memories and cultures and perspectives are brought from the past, and they are passed among generations. So what we see here in the first image in 1958 is an image from the Quilombo Cubirus in Maranhão in the northeast of Brazil. And some of these perspectives brought into the context of Redes da Maré, the organization I was mentioning, by using storytelling to recover ancestral knowledge with eldest residents and trying to pass along these forms of knowledge that are normally erased or neglected. And finally, how all of these women have been reclaiming stories and lived experiences. And I use these 2 words, saberes and conhecimento. Saberes and conhecimento are both words that mean knowledge in Portuguese and in Spanish. But mainly these are not the traditional forms of knowledge that we are used to seeing in the technical scientific terms, but rather these ways in which the women, these women have been crafting and narrating how all these labor practices have been disrupted and changing the geopolitics of knowledge. Here, the image that you're seeing is Carolina Maria de Jesus. She's a woman who lived in the favela of Canindé, the informal settlement in the 1960s in São Paulo that was about to be removed. And Carolina wrote in her diaries the experience of being a Black woman living in this context. And what is really interesting about her work is that it is through her lived experiences that we can see what was actually happening in São Paulo at the time. The evictions, the injustices, the floodings, the pain of being a paper collector, and so on. And yeah, that's it. So these are a few ideas that I wrap up for you with some of the authors connecting East Africa and Latin
Our final speaker this evening is my colleague Adriana Allen, Professor of Development Planning and Urban Sustainability at the DPU. Adriana has over 30 years of experience in the field of development planning, socio-environmental justice, and feminist political ecology. And amongst her recent research projects, she was the PI of a project called Overdue, tackling the sanitation taboo across Africa. And she also worked with me on the KNOW program, which some of you may be familiar with, the Knowledge in Action in Urban Equality, on the question of critical urban pedagogies. That was the theme that she worked on in KNOW. So I think to also add, which I think is also important to know about Adriana, is that between 2019 and 2023, she was the president of Habitat International Coalition, which gives her a unique international overview of the housing conditions of people all over the world. So I believe that she's going to share her thoughts on this topic today through her work in Overdue. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Karen, and thanks to everyone, and everyone also looking there now online for joining us today. Well, the conversation is getting super interesting, and I'm really glad we're going to have some time for discussion. just a parenthesis before I start, I had the pleasure to hear a lot more about Bruna's PhD and to examine Jordana's PhD, and I do recommend that you read the work of these two extraordinary women because they have to be on the list in terms of the many minds, many scholars, not incidentally, scholars who are usually also activists, who really help us to turn this page that we call the feminist term of environmental justice. Difficult to pick one thing, one turning point, but I tried to do that. I tried to think, okay, if I was to pick on one, what could that be? And I thought about talking perhaps about the turning point that a few additional authors, scholars, and activists add, in my view, in helping us to approximate environmental justice and, of course, the material and social world that couple with each other, but through something that happens across intersectionality and subalternity, two concepts that we use, but sometimes we don't use in relationship with each other, and of course through something that has been put already on the table, through situated experiences, lived experiences, and narratives, those voices that we're talking about. So in addition to the many authors that we have here, from Vandana Shiva to Veronica Gago, Nascimento and Saldúa, and many more, and of course Crenshaw and Spivak. Yeah, it would be extraordinarily important when we think about intersectionality and subalternity. We got a new vocabulary thanks to all these women, and sometimes also a few men that have done interesting things, like Ivan Illich, I would say, for instance, already in the 70s. I was thinking very much about the work of Diana Rochelet. Yeah? And Diana Rochelet, you might be familiar with her. For many, she is like the mother, again, in the way we get to know these scholars, which of course is very much filtered through certain, through the Anglophone world and so on. But we could say she's in many ways the mother or a significant scholar in the foundation of feminist political ecology. What is interesting is Diana Rochelet wrote a book which I recommend you to read, which is precisely called Feminist Political Ecology, which was published in 1996. And if you look at that book, you will find that actually she was talking about things that were absolutely ignored in the same, by another very important book called Liberation Ecologies, published by Pitt and Watts, exactly in the same year. So political ecology didn't have the feminist question massively in the radar. And we're talking about 1996. Of course, in other parts of the world, this was happened much earlier. So why do I find what she says quite interesting? Well, because she pushes us very much to think that we can understand environmental injustices. She doesn't talk about the plural, but I think that's very important that we talk about the plural, by departing from situated experiences. And I'm going to quote her. And expand our respective partial and situated knowledges by going beyond identity into affinities, and then to work from affinities to coalitions. It sounds like a mouthful, yeah? But again, going beyond identities into affinities, and then to work from affinities to coalitions. What is important here is just she's taking issue with the way in which we are using the whole language of identities as a way of fixing, describing different categories according to race, according to age, according to gender, etc., class, and so on. And she's saying that's not enough. If we are really going to engage truly with situated experiences and voices, we need to look at the way in which these people, these women, these girls, these men, directly present themselves in terms of their own affinities. And of course, move from those affinities into coalitions, because they are not passive, they are not vulnerable, as Jordana was saying. They have agency. I think that she gives us really strong ammunition, to work differently. So I'm going to, as Karen said, I'm going to just to try to see if we were to apply some of these ideas from a project I have the pleasure, absolute pleasure, to work with many colleagues in the room, Colin, Pascal, and I think that we have also Claudie Bouet online, Call Overdue, as Karen said, which basically aim to do that, offer a 360 feminist degrees perspective on what just sanitation means and looks like across African cities. We work with in 7 cities with an amazing group of organizations, some more focused on sanitation, some much more focused on feminism and really learning from each other, in the cities of Freetown, Beira, Mwanza, Bukavu, San Luis, Abidjan, and Antananarivo. A lot more you can find out about the project, and I'm going to share the website at the end. In drawing from overview, I look at the many videos that were produced with the actual, the actual recipients, the actual people who are at the core of these injustices, and you can access them directly on the website. They're all subtitled. They are in the original languages, but subtitled into English. I'm just going to use a few quotes because of the time, and I'm also going to read the rest because of the time. Otherwise, we're not going to have time for discussion. What I want to do is to stop on 3 sides. 3 sides that I think that we found, and I find personally very productive in putting into motion, into action, a feminist perspective into the understanding and advancing of the fight against environmental injustices. The first one is the side of the bodies. And in starting with this side, obviously I'm not just talking about bodies as biological systems, but very much as fundamentally political and social bodies. In dealing with their bodily fluids and those of others, most women and girls across urban Africa encounter all forms of violence on a daily basis. And here I want to highlight, and I'm not just talking about the violence of lacking access to adequate sanitation, the violence of having to be forced to defecate in the open, or the violence of even facing sexual harassment or even rape just in the act of releasing yourself. I'm talking instead about the violence and injustices produced and reproduced through socially constructed norms that we call widely or broadly taboos, which are paradoxically enforced to protect their own bodies. One key feeling that we found when running, and this is, I just invite you to again look at some of the quotes from some of the narratives and the stories shared from many of the women that we interview in the field. One of the feelings running throughout many of their stories, many of the testimonies across the 7 cities, even if I couldn't include more here, is that of women's bodies being disgusting. Control over their body fluids extends to the disgust they face, as you will see in some of the stories, if they make noise or produce a smell as they release themselves, or give away their nakedness when being at the toilet. What is important to notice here is that women's bodies become dirty bodies and cheating bodies, bodies to be controlled and regulated at all costs, that don't even escape social scrutiny in the privacy of a toilet, something that most of us can claim to be able to do. Women's bodies are not only treated as offensive because of the gases, noises, and smells they produce when they pee and they poop, but also because they menstruate. And menstruation, we found, and many others of course, is one of the sites where control is exercised with most violence, ruling the separation and isolation between menstruating bodies from others, even those in their most inner circles. Let me now move quickly to the second side, the side of practices. Through multiple encounters with women and girls in the field, we found that dealing with sanitation involves not only very risky tasks and very long hours, but also heavy mental workload, which is typically overlooked. Unfortunately, in the development field, sanitation is typically approached as a deeply masculinized sector and set of practices in which women are at best featured as users. And this was a constant that we found when we were looking at policies, when we were talking to people involved in improving sanitation across Africa. But what we also found is that women are not just sanitation users, but fundamentally sanitation providers, as they run, maintain, and sustain sanitation lifelines. The masking of their unpaid work, something that Jordana clearly put on the table, as care and even duty, is a social construction reproduced not just through social and cultural norms, which is something that we got we were at least led to believe, but also through development interventions and many, many health campaigns and sanitation campaigns. Now, looking at their everyday practices and the language that defines them reveals another side of marginalization and subordination that not only denies the physical health and mental burden that sanitation represents for them, but also the essentializing nature of calling what they do day in and day out care. And this is again another point that Jordana clearly put on the table. The bodies of marginalized and stigmatized men and boys also come together in the daily making of sanitation across African cities through multiple practices. In St. Louis, for instance, when women cannot cope with the multiple tasks required to keep their sanitation facilities, whether at the household or at the neighborhood level, clean and safe, they seek the help of talibés. In many urban centers in Senegal, but also in other parts of West Africa, it is quite common to see young boys begging on the streets, clutching empty tins to collect donations. These boys are called colloquially talibés, which is a wolof term which etymologically speaking comes from the Arabic term talib, which means a seeker of knowledge in the Quran, but is also again usually and colloquially used to refer to boys who beg on the streets. Talibés, in this case, we found often work as an extension of women's bodies to deal with challenging tasks such as removing sludge manually from pit latrines. Other and many other male bodies perform similar tasks. For instance, those referred as frogmen or cacabailers in Freetown, murals across urban Tanzania, ninjas or human exhausters in Nairobi, and we found many, many other similar terms. Their work entails diving in pit latrines with buckets and a shovel to dig out compacted fecal sludge by hand, while they perform a critical job in stopping feces from flooding with shit. The homes of the majority of people living in the off-grid city, they are systematically criminalized and stigmatized. For this reason, they have to perform their work at night and also under dehumanizing conditions. In Freetown, for instance, we found that frogmen go through a ritual of self-intoxication that involves consuming several sachets of alcohol and also a number of drugs and other substances before, during, and after the performing their job of emptying a pit latrine, to be able to do it, to be able to recover from the act of what they have done. It takes about 6 hours and at least 3 men to do the job, to clean one or empty one pit latrine. In the Tanzania, bureaus, we found face fines that amount to at least half of their collective earning and also their risk imprisonment. Like the majority of women and girls in the off-grid city, talibés and bureaus and cacabailers are the de facto sanitation infrastructure of most African cities, while in doing so encounter all forms of violence and injustices on a daily basis, including physical and mental illness. Now, let me finally move into the reading of material practices, into the reading of the material things that make up the sanitation systems together with people's bodies and practices. There is clearly a significant bias in the sanitation sector, I would say, towards certain things. That is, towards the modern network sewage systems that transport human waste from flush toilets into treatment plants, the grid sanitation system, if you wish, that across Africa, at least across African cities, only serve a very small percentage of the population. We found typically that's usually 20% of the population in most African cities. This disregard for the things, the people and practices that make the off-grid sanitation universe is not incidental. It follows a pattern of differentiation and segregation initiated across urban Africa during colonial times, which persists in the post-colonial era. And we can see extraordinary similarities between the conditions of infrastructure and facilities that persist in the so-called then cane city and the concrete city, the quarters of the colonial settlers and the quarters of their servers. These processes are actively at play in the contemporary struggle for some form of sanitation across urban Africa, But yet, the things, that is the pit latrines, the buckets, the shovels, the bleach, the incense, and the sherry cans that sustain the sanitation systems of the poor are consistently overlooked by sanitation master plans and investments. To be clear, building sanitation infrastructure is one thing, but running and maintaining sanitation systems is a different matter, a matter that marks a difference between a facility and a facility that provides a service, and even further, between a service as a commodity and one that is sustained through unpaid work and stigmatized bodies and practices. This means that focusing on the physical dimension of infrastructure once built and the subsequent social effects it has does not illuminate the complex socio-technical, environmental, legal, spatial, and political economic processes that produce the facilities in the first place. Beyond these formal processes also lie a host of things and informal and embodied practices of creation, use, and adaptation that also comprise what we call infrastructure. Now, to conclude, I would argue that these three interlinked sides somehow open multiple possibilities of other ways, if you wish, of seeing and knowing, environmental and fighting and define environmental injustices. I have focused on one of them, and we could see that in this case as seeking sanitation justice and gender equality as one. Thinking through sanitation, housing, food, and many other critical urban lives from feminist perspectives reveals the fundamental dynamics of subalternity, of hierarchical architecture that is significantly still alive in the way we run our societies. Struggles over these lifelines, and this is, I think, extremely important to put on the table, are simultaneously a race struggle, a class struggle, a women's struggle, an age struggle, an environmental struggle, and more, all at once. Returning to the bigger question that brings us together today, the feminist term of environmental justice has given us, as Jordana was saying at the beginning, an intellectual and political vocabulary. We have a legacy, we have a lot to work with. All the people that Bruna took us through and many more extraordinary thinkers. But I think that there is still at least, I'm going to finish here, at least two perhaps key challenges where we could put much more pressure on ourselves and much more energy. For me, the first one is the importance of using the lenses of intersectionality and subalternity as complementary to each other. And this is to identify, fight, and mobilize both sides of oppression and of contestation. We tend to focus on one or the other, on one question or the other one that we open with. This implies working also with a messier understanding of genders. It's something that authors like Molet and Faria raised as an issue back in 2011. We tend to talk about all women as encompassing every other condition. And working towards a more or a messier understanding of gender is also connected or means challenging why and how being different across all these categories, gender, class, race, sexual orientation, and so on, is socially equated with being unequal. This is an extraordinarily important point. Why does it, being different in any of these ways, mean being unequal? And this is a real point where we need to with which, in my view, we need to take issue. Crenshaw put this very clearly back in 1997 when she said, and I think Ali quote here, it is fairly obvious that treating different things the same can generate as much inequality as treating the same thing differently. And I think that we need to think about that. Second, and to conclude, we face the critical challenge of what I would say call of dismantling camouflages. Just like race has been obscured behind reference to all women's experience, place and the environment are often used as a backdrop, as a background, where things happen, where people's experiences unfold, rather than a co-constituting critical factor of environmental injustice. And I think that we have a long way to go there. Power argued back in 2003 that we need to scrutinize how and why specific ideological formations and persistent normative assumptions that include, for instance, calling the environment natural resources, persist. Yeah, expectations, assumptions, and expectations have flowed somehow from colonialism into development and into post-colonial times. And I think that we have an obligation, a responsibility to really drill into these questions to make sure that the work we are doing doesn't remain either ahistorical or out of place. Thank you.
I think our speakers have given us an enormous amount to think about. So we have 30 minutes of our session left. I'm going to ask them to come and join me up in the front. And let's think a bit together on the basis of any questions you may have or any comments you may have from what you've heard. So anybody like to kick off? I know it's been very wide-ranging, but Colin, did I see your hand? Anything you'd like someone to say again or to make the argument again, clarify? Yes?
So you said, Adriana, well, first of all, thank you for your speeches. You said socially constructive norm produces violence. Could you please elaborate on this through your projects? What does it mean?
Okay, thank you. And let's just have the other question as well, and then we can put them together.
I just wanted, again, thank you, all of you. It was very interesting, very exciting to hear all of that. I was wondering, however, if at the beginning we started talking about ecofeminism, if we could talk about natives of the land, like where does environmental justice and then justice begin and end, and where does ecofeminism begin and end, or where do they, again, I think I was treating them as different things, and where do they intersect and help each other?
Okay, so let's start with the question of the social construction of violence in the context that you're talking about, which I imagine it then feeds directly into the injustices that we're talking about, the environmental injustice we're talking about.
I was talking about quiet, slow violence. I wasn't talking about violence as in criminal activities. Yeah? I was talking about the violence that go through people's, mostly women and girls' bodies that we can observe in sanitation. And I also talk not only about the socially constructed norms, but the statutory policies and laws that do the same. And this has to do with the notion of taboo. In overview, we decided not to talk about the sanitation crisis, which is the usual framing, but to frame it differently and to say, let's call it this thing that we call a crisis, and this scandal, the fact that 2.4 billion people still lack access to adequate sanitation across the world in 2024. Let's say it's not just a crisis, it's a taboo, because we are not discussing it in full. It's something that we keep on putting under the table. Now, those taboos, we sought to look at and peel off at different levels. And we found that, of course, many taboos in regulating women's bodies, for instance, when they menstruate, or as I show in some of the quotes, when they go to the toilet, but they cannot speak to a man who is outside, even if something is going to be spoiled, the woman says, because otherwise it's like cheating on her husband. That is a taboo. Or what happens with their blood when they're menstruating. All those are norms that are very much normalized sometimes as, that's the way things are. Yeah? And it is important to say that's not the way things are. These are still patriarchal ways in which, through cultural norms, we justify the subjugation, the creation of more subalternative conditions for women. But what we tried to do in particular was to show that it wasn't just through social and cultural norms that the taboos are operating. They also operate through policies that don't see, for instance, or take for granted the fact that actually, if you are going to have better, if you are going to exercise your right to sanitation, which is a human right, and most countries say, that is an individual task for your household to resolve. And that involves that hidden within that is relying, normalizing, naturalizing, essentializing the unpaid work that women have to do to produce adequate sanitation or approximate to that. That's what I meant about those violence.
Even if you want to come back on the question of violence. Before we go on to your question, I just want to say to those colleagues online, those our participants online, that if you'd like to pose a question, do write it in and we'll pick it up from Alvin. Thank you. Okay, so to the second question, which if I understood your framing, in a way you were asking, where does ecofeminism and environmental justice, where do they connect, where do they overlap?
Yeah.
Do you mean not just historically in terms of how they develop, but also intellectually?
Yeah.
Okay, would you like to pick that up?
I'll kick us off, but that is precisely my dilemma. Like, which is why I really struggled kind of how to move beyond this idea of like a feminist turn and like where we are now versus where things kind of started, right? And I think like it's hard to speak about like, I don't know. I think in terms of ecofeminism, I feel as though that falls within a space of feminist environmental justice. Like a lot of the claims that were being made, a lot of the arguments and assertions and the dynamics that were unpacked, like notwithstanding the critiques which hold a lot of validity, but if we look at like the structures that were rendered visible, the shared oppressions, and this connects with that lovely quote from Kimberly Crenshaw around needing to recognize when structures of oppression are similar and come from similar interests, whether they're kind of racialized or whether they're grounded in capital circuits or patriarchy. I feel like there's a big overlap in terms of the really important post-colonial critiques that Vandana Shiva, among others, were highlighting within ecofeminist debates, right? And I think we can very easily look at particular aspects of the narratives that were coming through and say that's essentializing, it's homogenizing. But it's important not to throw the so-called baby out with the bathwater. Do you know what I mean? I don't like that term, the feeling like I did. But like we need to not completely reject ecofeminism and a lot of the kind of narratives that came from there, because they have led the foundations to feminist political ecology and a lot of the importance of kind of thinking from different standpoints, right, and recognizing these structures. So I think like there's not a clear line for me as to where one ends and one begins, but what I see it as a helpful set of tools and critiques and kind of standpoints for critically engaging with people in all of their diversities, kind of relationships to nature, to environmental risk, to access to resources, to land struggles, whatever shape our environmental and climate justice like focus is looking at. I think it's a set of tools that have evolved.
No, I think just building on what Jordana is saying, I think it goes back to the situated experiences. So it goes back to the everyday, I would say. I think that's where we connect Jordana and Adriana in a way, in both of what they were sharing, in the sense that there are, for an example, there are specific policies in Rio de Janeiro that are aimed for all the women in terms of health access. But then you go to a specific informal settlement, what you're going to realize is that woman that works as a maid that needs to take 2 or 3 hours of commuting and has to take her kids to school. And at the same time, she doesn't have proper sanitation for her house, She is dealing with those violences that we just mentioned. And second, she is at the same time dealing with the overlap of all these identity markers that is locating her directly in this point of systematic oppression, of systemic oppression. And I think, for me at least, going back to the everyday, to the praxis, to the bodies, allows us to see that very clearly. It's very clear. You can see exactly what kind of oppressions are taking place. And because it is, the woman is black at the same time, she's a mother at the same time, she's a maid at the same time. So these are a series of violent structures that is conditioning her to this unequal position. And I think, for me at least, this is how it makes it very grounded.
Sure, happy to add to that. Such an interesting question. I think that it's important not to conflate ecofeminism with a feminist version or perspective of environmental justice. They are not the same. And I think that it's interesting to think also, why do we know, I mean, Vandana Shiva wrote many other things, apart from those two things that she can be quite criticized for, of essentializing women and essentializing, unpaid work as care work and so on. But it's interesting that in the West, if you are asked, name someone that said something in the intersection of these two things, the first name, and probably one of the few names that will come to your mind, if we say environmental justice and feminism, we will say Vandana Shiva. Yeah. It is quite interesting how the people, among the many more that wrote many more things, and even before her, because in the 70s already people were having quite strong, in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, they were saying many more things that were more political. It's quite interesting how there is this filter in which is us that usually help us only to think about pre-modern women almost, indigenous women. Women is like, that doesn't help us much in cities and so on. So we can't really get rid of all that thinking. So I think that we need to think quite critically. Of course, the tools, when we talk about this vocabulary that we have today, the legacy that we have thanks to many, doesn't just come from political ecology, from ecofeminism. It comes from post-structuralists, it comes from sometimes not even feminist scholars, and I think that is absolutely fine. We have to open our eyes. Yeah, it's not so. This affiliation, I think that this association of ecofeminism, a feminist perspective of environmental justice, usually reduces and boxes and says, I'm not interested in that.
Just before I pick up the question, are there any questions on that? Okay, so
So thank you to the three of you for great presentation. And perhaps my question is also an invitation, because this is grounded very much in your own work, in your own research, and we are at contrasting two different points. Perhaps if we think about listen, live, learn, and overdue, about methodologies. So how do these reflections translate into methodologies in the case of the first project for Jordana and Bruna? How do we raise evidence about this? And perhaps, I know Adriana, you probably have a lot to say about that as well, but in the case of overdue, after the maturity of the project, how do we turn that into a narrative that actually resonates with policymakers? I think in your case, perhaps it would be interesting to hear about that. How do we translate these conceptual reflections into turning evidence into practice?
So, two questions.
Or two, I don't know. 5 or 6 or one at the back.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. I had a question on the vocabulary. So in the first presentation, you mentioned that there is no equivalent to nature in Swahili, and therefore, in terms of language, it was a bit difficult to maybe it put some hurdles in communication. And in the last presentation, you referred to the little boy that stands on the street, and the word comes from Arabic, I think. Yes. So if you were to entangle these taboos and make the situation and evolve the situation, what would be the right or maybe more ethical approach, knowing that the situation or the context, the vocabulary is not very existent compared to the reference that we have in our European context. So, from a feminist point of view, what's the right approach to help maybe put the right words without imposing or creating a new form of colonizing basically mind or imposing those ideas?
So again, a very important question, and certainly one which I've dealt with all my years of working with gender, because gender itself is a term which is very complicated to translate into many languages, and it was a discussion, a debate all round, in many different places. Okay, so I think first of all, shall we go to the reflections on the impact of taking a perspective that is focused on environmental justice and the feminist view of environmental justice and its implications for really what you were saying was for research methodology. I was going to say research methodology, because the next question is less to do with research. So would you like to kick off?
Maybe if Adriana, I think Bruno and I probably have a lot to say about methodologies and the tensions that we're kind of dealing with right now. So Adriana, if you want to, we can, and we'll feed off so that we don't steal all of it. I have a lot of work there.
Okay, briefly, and perhaps just covering or linking the two questions. Research methodology, ways of doing things, of course, is so important. I mean, there is no epistemic injustice, it's a big part of it that you have to break through. And you could be talking the language and not doing it. And so methodology is precisely that. It's not the boring bit of the research project where you just this X number of interviews, but it's very much that moment where you actually really deliver on what your framing is. For us, I think that, there are colleagues also from Overdue, so I would be very happy for Colin or Pascal or Claudie online to also add to this. But I would highlight two things. One that was connected to perhaps, at that time, it was a discovery in the case of Overdue, and it was connected to the fact that I was also having a very strong role in KIC, as president of KIC, and doing a lot of advocacy. And that somehow took me to explore and take much more seriously advocacy as a research methodology. And that's something that we did in Overdue a lot. Partly also because we started the project during COVID. The project started in 2020. So we decided that suddenly to go to the field and go ahead with the plan was absolutely, insensitive. And that got us to start, for instance, with festivals, sanitation festivals, where the teams locally said, don't give us soap, don't give us anything like that. What we need is to bring to the fore the fact that these, the pit latrine emptiers, the women in the household, the cleaners of toilets and so on, are the heroes that you are clapping for in Europe at 7 o'clock every evening during the pandemic, because they are the ones stopping the pandemic. From that point, I think that we understood that actually advocacy wasn't going to be something that methodologically was going to happen after we have the findings to deliver to the policymakers, but advocacy was a mode of research. And I think that changed things a lot. That meant that at the end, towards the end, and I didn't share that slide, but we ended with a big campaign that we call CRAVE, Just Sanitation for African Cities, and we mobilized mayors and so on, but we didn't do that just at the end. In the knowledge exchange visits and so on, we were always telling the teams, think about who is your champion, who is going to mobilize this, who is going to make a fuss and change something around this. Then bring her or him, to the next knowledge exchange city, because that's a local mobilizer, and we need that person. And of course, there is a lot to say about language, but I stop here, and then if there is time, I'm happy to come back to language, because we work a lot on glossaries. Your question is super important. Your question. Do you want to?
Yeah, and I'll pick up on both, because for me the two questions are intimately tied to what we're working through as a team. And I think, so thinking about methodologies and the kinds of methods that we're using and how to translate complexity into policy, I think there's different temporal moments within the research process. And I think so parking policy for a second, I think thinking through these kind of epistemic injustices that you mentioned, and the lexicons of urban resilience research or advocacy, doesn't matter what it is, the languages that are coming, they're very Western and they come with the money. So how we've navigated that, or how we're trying to, because it's very much in early days, but I think we're trying to not to be led by the language that people are using. So that's methodological, which requires unlearning our own language. It requires us to not use terms like nature-based solutions. So trying to like speak about subjects without using jargon, I think, which is complicated and time-consuming, and I don't know how it's going to work yet because we haven't fully tested that. But that's what we're trying to do, is to think, how can we not use language that is laden with all these assumptions and ideas of already knowing something? How can we remove ourselves from that and speak around a subject to understand the justice dimension, which is really about how nature, in some ways, could be used by people to address things that are important to the people that we're working with, right? That's the crux of it. So removing ourselves from World Bank and other kind of definitions of NBS to think from more grounded context, I think that is one thing. And I'm definitely provoked, and something I want to think about is your provocation to sit with intersectionality and subalternity as like two things that I think I do that and we do that in different ways. But I think that that's interesting. And through Bruna's work, I've also been provoked to think through how are we engaging with temporality, both in terms of histories of knowledge production, histories of engaging with nature, histories of understanding and experiencing different oppressions. I think methodologically, how we can kind of feed in these historic ways of knowing and being in the world, I think are really important to developing alternative ways of knowing, I think. How to translate that for policymakers, we have a team of people that know how to do that. I'm not one of them, but no, I made that light. I think it's, again, about speaking, it's about mirroring language, right? So I think part of what we do as researchers is to try to engage with different types of stakeholders and audiences. As activists, we do that. As practitioners, we do that. And so one thing that's helpful is to mirror the language that's coming through to say the same thing to different audiences and package it in a way that relates to different audiences. Bruna, I don't know if you have anything to add.
I just want to compliment what you were saying, because that, to me, that goes back into positionality and reflexivity. It's really hard not to go back to that specific point of reflection, because from my entire PhD, my whole issue was that I'm a Brazilian woman from, the south side of Rio de Janeiro, which is the wealthiest area of the city, working in a group of informal settlements where the majority of the people are Black people, and in Brazil I'm considered white. And all the time I would be so immersed, because it's my language, it's my country. So I would be so tricked by all these terms and how I would, embrace an ethics of care in the way that I was building relationships with the people, in the way that I was relating to the mobilization processes that were taking place there. And then now I see myself in this complete different scenario where I am looking into a language that I don't speak at all, although I've done a bit of Duolingo. I don't speak it at all. And what is really interesting about it is that I was looking into some of the terms with our team back in Tanzania, and they were like, climate resilience, this is such a hard term to translate. It becomes an entire sentence in Kiswahili. And then I kept thinking like, okay, so how do we handle this? And many times it's just the matter that we avoid or change or contest or disrupt these jargons in a way that we can find a way to communicate and understand that the language carries all that baggage that, in 3 years, we're not going to be able to handle all of this, but we can certainly find ways that the language that they already know, they can build up in the ways that we are developing our positionality, our reflexivity as researchers, and working directly with the people and the different audiences. And one of the tasks is, so Dasha, my partner in crime as postdoc, we're often like looking into the form, the interview guides, and we're looking at, okay, don't mention NBS, nature and people relations. We're trying to find ways that we can open up the discussion and not frame it and narrow it. I guess that's where we are trying to build up.
In countries, NBS means the National Building Society. Rita, you wanted to come in on this?
Yeah, I wanted to come in on this because I find it quite interesting that we continue to talk about nature and people, and precisely
precisely in the context that you finally found not a name for nature, it's actually something to embrace, because in a sense, nature is a construct, is an abstraction.
Yeah.
It's precisely the very thing that is the way of establishing a distance between human and non-humans. So surely, rather than looking for a translation for this term, which essentially people might talk about trees, water, animals, and people as part of this thing that now we are referring to as nature. And, it's kind of we need to make a real conscious effort, because we have learned it so deeply, this division between people and nature. But I find it extremely interesting to recapture precisely the very, from the cultural positions where this does not exist. And let's not try and find something to replace it and translate it. Let's actually come from those conceptualizations and therefore what it means for our work.
I'm happy to come on that and also connect what Rita is saying with, again, one of the previous points. I think that we have to be think a lot about not just creating one line of translation and say, oh, there's no terms, let's find a way and so on. Because that translation also brings with it unintended epistemic injustice, and we are the perpetrators of that. I think that's what Rita is saying. We found that it's not only the fact, and that can be done by reversing the flow in a way. Like in Overview, we created 2 glossaries, and I think that's, I don't know if Nelly Leblond is online. She was one of the members of the team, but she was working very close with the Francophone teams, and she says at certain point, she put it very beautifully, we didn't set out to write a glossary, but writing a glossary, in this case of sanitation, in Wolof, became a necessity. And it wasn't a technical, it wasn't a way of letting people know, okay, all the things that, development programs and so on come to do, people, you don't understand French or English, we tell you how it sounds in Wolof. It wasn't a patronizing glossary, it was the other way around. It was an attempt to tell policy makers that make policies that only live in French, in a country where people mostly speak, and mostly women speak and manage Wolof, to turn that the other way around and to say, sorry, it's you policymakers that have to start writing policies in Wolof. And I think that was very, very important. So there is a blog, I didn't give the website, but do look for that glossary. And there was another glossary that came up of a collab in the space where practitioners came together from across, I think that there were 25 countries across countries actually, across Africa. And they decided also to create this collective glossary. And this glossary, again, is not seeking, they call it a politics glossary, glossary of poo, and politics of poo. And it's not trying to, again, create, okay, so what's the closest in English? But it's trying to respect that this way of calling things is quite important. And we can incorporate it in our language. And that's why we're talking about buras, cacabailers. We're not translating those. That's the way. Frogmen, frogmen you will understand English. But I think that it's very, very important not to translate everything into English and to think that careful translation can do. Careful translation still cannot do it. It still doesn't do it. It still reduces the conversation we have.
Folks, we've come to the end of our evening, and I would
just a word from Claudie on that.
Okay, please.
She's saying that very practically right now she's using the work we did as part of Overdue to train Francophone mayors on gender and sanitation, trying to give them different perspectives to sanitation policies and practices. Maybe we've got a question. I don't know if you want to take it.
Let's take one quick question.
Okay, this question is to Bruna. She thanks Bruna for the useful attention given to the actors in the first slide. But in later slides, they're wondering if maybe you can say a bit more on how the notion of ancestral futures is part of your own research and how this interesting way of looking at memory and projection is also enacted in your everyday research.
Wow.
This question might be important.
I've got a minute. It's really
The concept of history has disappeared.
Oh my god. Okay. So the role of ancestral futures in the research. I guess because I was working with a territory and a particular group of women that built their knowledges based on intergenerational knowledges, the notion of building, bringing ancestrality or ancestry into thinking of the future is part of the way that they are trying to reduce the local inequality. They're trying to recognize particularly Black women, Black men. In the context of my PhD, we were looking at a territory where the majority of deaths are of young Black men. So we're talking about a severe public security issue in terms of the drug dealing scenario of Rio, where the state treats that territory as an exception, as a territory to be combated, and then looking in the ways that particularly the women are trying to build knowledges and passing these knowledges along generations. That's where this notion of ancestry becomes central into the way that like younger generations learn from older generations and how they take these knowledges forward. I guess.
Thank you.
My pleasure. That was hard.
Very hard. Folks, I want to thank all our speakers this evening for giving us an enormous amount to think about and for really provoking a very, very interesting discussion. So can we give them a big clap of applause?